Warning, the show you are about to watch is very, very naughty. They talk about scary movies and frightening stuff and other really inappropriate things, and it's only appropriate for people over the age of 18, and frankly, even they shouldn't watch it, and if you keep watching, I wash my hands of the whole thing.
Stories have been around for all of recorded history, and whether we call them myths, fables, fairy tales, or urban legends, they're an important piece of the fabric of society. So how have these stories evolved over the years to remain relevant in changing times? We'll look at a couple of different examples coming up on this episode of Spooky Tales with Steve the Cat. Hello and welcome to Spooky Tales with Steve the Cat, PBDCtv's place for a fun and entertaining discussion of horror movies. I'm your host, Steve the Cat. Now, as we have discussed before, it takes a lot of money to maintain a high-class operation such as this one. So this season, we've been happy to take on a new sponsor, the fine folks at the scientific task force called Project Brevity. Project Brevity scans deep space for broadcast signals, particularly from old VHS-era horror movies, and we help them to analyze and interpret the data. We're still crunching through the images from our first batch of deep space data, and tonight we're going to talk about this image. As you can see, it's pretty badly distorted, so I've handed it off to see what our expert staff can make of it. So let's fire up a quick teleconference with our associate producer, Fancy the demonically possessed animatronic, and see what he's been able to figure out. So, Fancy, are you there? What have we got?
I'm here, Steve. At first we thought it might be some type of demon, but I've asked around with some of my old associates, and it turns out that it's some variety of space vampire.
Space vampire? Is that a real thing? I mean, they had one on Buck Rogers all those years ago, but I assume the actor was just making an excuse so he could nibble on Aaron Gray.
Oh yeah, they're real. They're pretty common, actually. They like it in outer space since it's so dark and the cold doesn't really bother them. All those Mothman sightings in West Virginia back in the 60s were actually a space vampire.
Really? So the Mothman is actually some sort of space vampire?
Oh, no. The Mothman is real. He just wasn't in West Virginia at the time. He got blamed for that bridge collapse, though. He's still paying off the court-ordered damages.
Right, got it. Hey, Fancy, speaking of court-ordered damages, have we received a bill from the new catering service yet?
There is no reason to suspect that any harm has come to the owner of our new catering service.
Fancy? I never said something had happened to the caterer. Okay, Fancy, stop me if you've heard this question before, but did you murder the caterer?
Oh no, Carl told me not to do that. He's fine. Well, he was fine when I left him there. If he finds his way back, I'm betting he gives me that 5% price reduction I was after.
Wait, hold the phone. Find his way back from where? You know what? Never mind. I don't want to know. Penelope put you in charge of the budget. It is your problem. So anyway, we've managed to trace this image back to a classic horror film from the 1980s, and this gives us a chance to talk about a couple of films that take old stories or urban legends into a new and different environment. So with that, we'll get the show started. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really glad you're here. Now, here we go.
And now it's time for Gwen's history lesson.
Hello, and welcome to Gwen's history lesson. I am your host, Gwenivere. The decade of the 1970s was a time of tremendous political and societal change. While people's distrust of traditional institutions deteriorated as a result of the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal, the public simultaneously experienced financial hardships in the form of energy shortages and rising inflation. At the same time, smog and pollution became recurring topics for the nightly news, as did soaring rates of crime and drug use, and a vague sense of hopelessness hung over the national consciousness like a fog. While it may be possible to identify factors that contributed to rising inflation or distrust in government, other events occurred in the 1970s that defy explanation. For example, the rise of disco music, along with its associated fashions and lifestyles, cannot be explained by known science. Similarly, the rise of 1970s phenomena such as conversation pits and shag carpeting continued to elude any rational explanation. There is, however, one mystery from the 1970s that has eclipsed all others in terms of both its scale and its defiance of any rational explanation. I am referring, of course, to the phenomenon of 1970s hairstyles. The 1970s infatuation with wings, mullets, and man perms is inexplicable. No surviving historical records from the era provide any explanation for the popularity of these hairstyles, and survivors of the era admit that they have no recollection of why they embraced such aesthetically disturbing trends. Was the 1970s infatuation with disconcerting hairstyles simply a case of societal mass hysteria, or were more sinister forces involved? In tonight's episode we will examine the mystery of 1970s hairstyles through two different approaches, with input from leading researchers in each field. Our first guest is an expert in spiritual, paranormal, and psychic phenomena, who goes by the name Lavender Harlequin. Mr. Harlequin, what can you tell us about the rise of disturbing hairstyles in the 1970s?
Good evening, Gwenivere, and thank you for having me on your show. As you mentioned in your introduction, the 1970s were a time of tremendous social upheaval. This, of course, had a significant impact upon the spiritual health and wellness of the entire planet. As the public became more cynical and distrustful of previously respected institutions, negativity and bad vibes began to permeate Gaia's spiritual aura like a virus, spreading to all corners of the globe and affecting every creature on the planet. The rise in disturbing hairstyles was an unconscious response to this stimulus. In effect, it was a spiritual immune response to the negativity infecting Gaia's aura, an attempt to insulate and shield our collective consciousness from bad vibes.
So the hairstyles of the 1970s were intended to function as a protective layer to shield us from the negative energies of the era? That is fascinating.
Yes, Gwenivere, I have used my own psychic powers to astrally project my consciousness back to that era on any number of occasions, and my gift has allowed me to witness this phenomenon very clearly. In layman's terms, imagine the power of the world's collective consciousness wrapping each individual's head in a form of protective bubble wrap to avoid breakage during shipping.
Thank you very much for that fascinating discussion. And now, to discuss the phenomenon of 1970s hairstyles from a different perspective, we welcome back conspiracy enthusiast and published author Crimson Meerkat, a frequent guest and friend of this program. Mr. Meerkat, can you expound upon Mr. Harlequin's characterization of 1970s hairstyles as a psychic response to the bad vibes of their era? I am given to believe you have a differing opinion.
Good evening, Gwenivere, and thank you once again for having me on your show. First of all, let me start off by saying that Lavender Harlequin is a well-known fraud and charlatan, and his characterization of hairstyles as a psychic immune response are laughable. I am not some carnival sideshow fortune teller. I am a credentialed writer who has published 3 books, and I have a 4th book coming out this spring. I have no use for fraudulent, psychic mumbo-jumbo. I am only interested in science, and the science clearly indicates that the hairstyles of the 1970s resulted from the presence of aliens.
That certainly is a very different explanation. Are you saying that aliens used some sort of mind control device to bring about the hairstyles of the 1970s? For what reason would they do such a thing?
Well, Gwenivere, it is important to understand that the decade of the 1970s corresponded with the arrival of a species of migratory extraterrestrials known as the Tobe people of Vega Nebula 9. This is a species of peaceful and docile aliens with a powerful migratory instinct, which causes them to travel from one side of the galaxy to the other from time to time, much like geese flocking to the south, or deadheads flocking to wherever Jerry Garcia happened to be at the time. The process takes centuries, and it's not uncommon for them to make stops along the way to feed and refuel and stretch their legs, so to speak. Since the Tobe people are peaceful, they are particularly vulnerable to predators, and their only defense is a well-developed talent for camouflage. Basically, they identify a host and then blend in by riding around on top of the host's head, taking on the appearance of a natural head of hair. Unfortunately, this approach was not compatible with the men's crew-cut hairstyles that were so popular after World War II. So the toupee people spent a great deal of time slowly influencing society to bring about the hairstyles of the 1970s, which provided them with a large environment in which to hide. The world's governments knew about this, of course, but since the toupee people were peaceful and not planning to stay for more than a decade or so, they agreed to allow this to occur in exchange for new hair care technology, which is only now reaching the market in the form of all-in-one body wash and shampoo for men. By the 1980s, hairstyles had evolved to the point that the toupee people could no longer blend in, so they moved along peacefully.
Gwenivere, I object to this man being allowed to slander me on your show. Ooh, the famous Crimson Meerkat with his books and driving his fancy Yugo and living in a spacious refrigerator box with a waterfront view. You've sold out and gone soft, Meerkat. Well, I'm willing to get my hands dirty and do the grunt work of investigating unexplained events, unlike fancy rich people like you, looking down from your ivory tower with your exquisitely manicured hands. You're no better than that pretentious bag of gas, Edgar Fluffosaurus. My gift had warned me that you might say something like this, but I agreed to appear on this show anyway because I care only about getting the truth out.
Your gift? Your gift? What gift are you talking about? Your ability to snort massive quantities of cocaine? That's why you talk so fast, isn't it? Gwenivere, I don't know what this guy told you, but his real name isn't Lavender Harlequin. It's Eduardo Sanchez, and he used to live on Pablo Escobar's compound down in Bogota, Colombia. He may have changed his name and moved to San Francisco, but he can't escape from that white powdery monkey that's riding on his back. This guy and I were on the same panel at ConspiracyCon in Bozeman, Montana back in 2019, and let me tell you, while we were in the green room, he snorted a quarter of a key in one breath, then he freaked out and started to pull up the carpet because he was sure there were tiny elves spying on him from beneath the floorboards.
Lies! Slander! I have never used cocaine. I don't even know what cocaine looks like. And the only monkey on my back is you smelly tree-swinging hack.
Monkey? How dare you, sir? I am not a monkey. I am an ape. Ape! Monkeys have tails. Do you see a tail? Or are you too high to see straight? I was prepared to have a spirited debate with you, but I will not stand for your disgusting and primate-phobic slurs about my heritage. Thank you for having me, Gwenivere, but I'm dropping out now.
Gwenivere, my gift told me that this would happen, but when you're a Lightbringer, you sometimes have to bear the slings and arrows of the willfully blind. It is our lot in life to be ridiculed by the less spiritually evolved. And now I have to go. My skin is starting to itch, and I need to, go put on some lotion. Thank you for having me, Gwenivere. Bye-bye.
This brings us to the end of an uninformative and unusually combative episode of Gwen's history lesson. Please join us later this week on our podcast, where we will discuss the sinister origins of lycra spandex leggings. In the meantime, I am Gwenivere. Thank you for watching.
And now it's time for our featured film reviews.
It is time for our first featured film review. So the image that we decrypted from deep space is of a space vampire, which leads us to this film right here. Yes, the classic film Lifeforce. If you're not familiar with this one, it is a horror sci-fi film released in the year 1985, directed by Tobe Hooper, yes, the same guy that directed Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Poltergeist a few years before this one. And the cast includes Steve Railsback, Peter Firth, Frank Finlay, and the very lovely Matilda May. Let's get into setting your expectations for this film. So when you go into this film, what you should expect is an 80s era VHS classic about vampires from outer space. So as we talked about at the beginning of this episode, it takes a familiar story, in this case the story of vampires, and puts it not only in a modern setting, which has been done a million times, but puts it in a modern outer space kind of setting, which is a little bit different. Now, this film is similar in concept to Species, but from a decade earlier. So a decade before Species, you had this film. So just swap out young Natasha Henstridge for young Matilda May, and you have Lifeforce. Some people will prefer one to the other, but frankly, that's one of those questions for which there is no wrong answer. If you like Event Horizon, you might like this film, or if you like Species, you might like this film. And let's get into calibrating your sights for this film. So, this is the scale we like to use. On the far left side of this scale, we have very campy films, such as Jason X. On the far right side of the scale, we have very serious films, such as The Silence of the Lambs. As we tell you every week, this scale does not indicate the quality of the film. This scale is an indicator of what your mindset needs to be going into the film in order to maximize your enjoyment. Lifeforce was intended as a mainstream motion picture release, so it is pretty well right down the middle. Now, it was not particularly successful when it was released. And if you watch the film, you can kind of see that this is not a film that's necessarily going to appeal to a mainstream audience. It has kind of taken on a second life as a cult classic, though. Now, before we go any farther, we have to get into our vocabulary lesson. This, of course, is the part of the show where we discuss new and inventive words and phrases in an effort to stay ahead of social media bots and algorithms that would otherwise try to ban our conversation. We've got 2 terms for this movie, so let's get into it. Our first term is dandelion plucking. Dandelion plucking is a noun that refers to the action of suddenly plucking a limb from a zombie or otherwise undead character. This frequently involves the loss of an arm. Our second term is sandblasting. This is a noun that refers to the action of an undead character violently exploding into a cloud of dust. So both of our terms this week, pretty vampire undead centric, which makes sense because it's a film about space vampires. So let's get into a film summary of Lifeforce. In this film, the space shuttle Churchill, with a joint American and British crew, discovers a 150-mile-long spaceship hidden inside the tail of Halley's Comet. One of the amusing things about this film is the fact that it puts forth the proposition that the British actually have a space program with a space shuttle. It's kind of funny. The crew visit the apparently derelict ship and recover 3 humanoid specimens that are apparently in suspended animation. Yep, they just take them right off the ship. It's no different than an alien abduction when you get down to it. The astronauts just go on board, find these 3 aliens sleeping, and take them. The Churchill returns to Earth, but when it gets there, it's gutted by fire and the entire crew is dead. They have to launch another shuttle to intercept it to find out what happened. Fortunately, the humanoid specimens are intact. Or maybe fortunately. So certainly there is no harm in bringing the humanoid specimens down to Earth, right? Well, if you know anything about any movie made ever, you know the answer to that is yes, there could certainly be a lot of harm in that. Which brings us to our villain profile. Our villain for this film is a smoking hot female space vampire, and if you don't believe me, there she is. She even looks kind of smoking hot when she's just a blood-covered hallucination. She belongs to the class of smoking hot female space vampire. Her special powers include energy draining, telepathy, shape-shifting, and smoking hotness, which she uses to disarm unsuspecting men. And her signature technique is a combined use of her smoking hotness to lower the victim's defenses, combined with then finishing the victim off using her vampiric energy draining ability. So that's your villain for this film, played by the lovely Matilda May. Let's talk about some of the things I liked about this film. So, this combines horror and science fiction, which are 2 genres that I love. This is kind of what we talked about at the beginning of the program. This takes a familiar horror archetype of vampire and puts it into a sci-fi environment. So it takes a traditional legend, puts it into a new kind of setting, so kind of a new spin on the vampire story. It manages to incorporate elements normally associated with a zombie outbreak film into a vampire film. In that way, it reminds me of the film The Night Watchman that we talked about last season, where technically it's a vampire film, but the vampirism is spreading much in the same way that zombieism spreads and during a zombie outbreak during a zombie film. So it's not just a situation where you've got 1 or 2 vampires that you're concerned about. You have a full-blown outbreak. It has bold use of color. It's a very colorful film. There are large sets and large settings for the action, so it does not have the claustrophobic feel of a small budget film. The interior of the alien spaceship is just cavernous, and many of the sets are just large and wide open, so it doesn't have the claustrophobic feel that a lot of small budget movies have. And finally, Matilda May is both incredibly beautiful and frequently naked. Let's talk about some things that could have been better in this film. Well, right off the bat, it may feel a little too sci-fi for a straight-up horror fan. So if you're a horror fan that does not really enjoy science fiction, this one might not be for you. It's something they did to try to take the vampire story into a new realm, but maybe it doesn't work for you. That said, despite the introduction of sci-fi elements, the film is still a vampire film, which unfortunately makes it feel a bit too predictable. This is often the story with vampire films, werewolf films, and so on, is that they're building off of the same archetype that's been done a million times before, and they become predictable. The film drags in the middle. It definitely drags in the middle. The middle of the film basically boils down into a manhunt of the smoking hot female vampire has escaped from a government lab, and there's a team looking for her and trying to find her, and there's just too much running around and not going on in the middle of the film. The space special effects and the zombie and zombification special effects in this film, not particularly impressive by modern standards. They were pretty good at the time. They're nothing to write home about now. It is not an acting tour de force. And finally, the ending does not make a lot of sense and lacks resolution. It's one of those things where it's just kind of over and you stare at the screen and say, okay, I'm not sure what just happened. Could have gone with a minute or two more resolution at the end, but they didn't go that route. So let's get to Steve's scorecard for this film. Kills. You have 13, plus another 9 off-screen, plus many, many more. The entire final act of this film is a long, continuous mass casualty event. It just goes on and on and on. And I won't say it's impossible to get a good victim count from it, but it is certainly more difficult than I can put time into in support of a weekly show. So we're just going to say many, many more. In addition to the 13 that you get to see up front and personal, and the 9 that we know happen off screen. Bare breasts, 10, and I believe that's all Matilda May. Well-trimmed hedges, 2. What do I mean by that? Well, recall that I did not say Matilda May spends much of the movie topless. I said she spends much of the movie naked. And of course, where you have well-trimmed hedges, you also might have floppy willies, although in this case, we are spared any floppy willy sightings. There are 0. Motorboatings, you do get one of those. Vampire canoodlings, you get a couple of vampire canoodlings, including one upright vampire canoodling. Dandelion pluckings, you get 1. Sandblastings, you get at least 2. Possumings, somebody run over by a moving vehicle, you get 1 of those. Infuegoinatings, you get 2 of those. Helicopter landing skids surfing, you get 2 of those. Yes, you get not 1, but 2 people surfing from the landing skid of a helicopter as it takes off and flies away. And finally, blood-spewing heads. Every movie needs blood-spewing heads. This one has 2. But with your viewing of Lifeforce, you get many, many fun bonus features. Let's talk about some of those. So, first of all, you get exposition via radio. Yes, my favorite movie-making trope in the world. Just by coincidence, we happen to hear something on the radio that is exactly what the audience needs to hear. Oh, it's so tiresome. You get cheesy orchestral opening music. It's kind of a sci-fi thing to have cheesy orchestral music, at least back in the 80s, so you kind of have to live with that at the beginning of the film. You get an alien spaceship interior that bears absolutely no resemblance to a giant birth canal. That is completely coincidental, and if you think it resembles a birth canal, that just means you have a dirty mind. They certainly were not trying to imply anything with the set design. You get space kidnapping action. Like I said, the crew of the Churchill goes over to this derelict spaceship, finds 3 people in suspended animation, and just kind of throws them in sacks and takes them back to the Churchill. Really no different from what the various aliens have done to Crimson Meerkat over the years. Why does the space shuttle even have human-sized specimen bags? What were they expecting to find that justified putting human-sized specimen bags on the space shuttle in the first place? It's not like they expected to find a derelict spaceship out there. What were they expecting to find? It does make one think. You get on-demand space shuttle launches. As I said, when the Churchill makes its way back to Earth, it's been gutted by fire and the crew is dead. So they had to send up another shuttle to intercept it. and bring the specimens down. Well, so it's nice and convenient that you can just launch space shuttles on demand and that it's not something that requires months and months of preparation. You get pre-Star Trek The Next Generation Patrick Stewart. Yes, this is from 1985. I believe Star Trek The Next Generation debuted, I want to say in 87? Maybe 88. So this is Patrick Stewart before he was Jean-Luc Picard. And of course, wherever you have Patrick Stewart, there is the risk that you will get some Picardian overacting, and you definitely get some Picardian overacting in this film. You get paparazzi slap in action. You get hoe slap in action. You get vampiric prime minister action. So let's get to Steve's final score for this film. I'm going to give it 2.5 paws out of 4. I'm going to say that this film was unsuccessful at the time of its release, because that is true, but this film has become a bit of a cult classic. It is interesting in concept, but predictable in execution. This is what happens when you take a vampire story and put it into any new context. At the end of the day, it's still a vampire story. It's still kind of predictable. It is a pretty good example of mid-1980s practical special effects. They're nothing to write home about by modern standards, but they are pretty good by 1980s standards. I would not say that they live up to the standard set in John Carpenter's The Thing from 1982, but they're pretty interesting. So, interesting film, worth watching if you're a horror fan. It's one of those classics that if you're a horror fan, you probably need to see once, even if you don't think you're going to be into it, just to check it off of your bucket list. So, that is the film Lifeforce, and that is Steve's final score for this film.
And now a word from our wonderful sponsors at PBDCtv, your nightly heartbeat of horror.
This is Mikey from Out of the Ordinary, and you're watching PBDCtv.
morning when I'm listening to music and getting a little bit of time for some creepy research, I'm always representing with my PBDC merch. What a better way to have a cup of coffee in the morning.
Don't forget to check out our other cool merch at rootsbleedred.com. That's rootsbleedred.com.
This is Professor Edgar Fluffosaurus from Spooky Tales with Steve the Cat, and when I'm not hosting Monster Chat or knocking down small Japanese cities, I'm watching PBDCtv. Now back to the show.
Let's get into our second featured film review for tonight. We're going to talk about this film right here, the VHS era classic, C.H.U.D, Cannibalistic Humanoid Underground Dwellers. This is a horror creature feature from the year 1984, directed by Douglas Cheek, and the cast includes John Hurd, Daniel Stern, Christopher Curry, and Kim Greist. Let's set your expectations for this film. What you should expect is a low-budget creature feature from the 80s that has become a cult classic. If you like humanoids from the deep, you might like this film. Basically, if you like any Roger Corman-esque low-budget creature feature, you may like this film, and that's from any era. Does not necessarily have to be a literal Roger Corman production. It could be some of the newer stuff like, Thanksgiving or Velocipaster or what have you. But anything along that line. Let's get into calibrating your sights a little bit. This is the scale we like to use. On the far left side of the scale, we have very campy movies, such as Jason X. On the far right side of the scale, we have very serious movies, such as The Silence of the Lambs. As always, this scale is not a measure of the quality of the film. It is an indicator of the mindset you need going into the film in order to maximize your enjoyment. C.H.U.D falls almost all the way over to the left. I mean, it's not a comedy, but come on, it's a movie called Cannibalistic Humanoid Underground Dwellers. It clearly is not a drama. Let's get into the vocabulary for this film. Vocabulary lesson, of course, is the part of the show where we discuss new and innovative words and phrases in an effort to stay ahead of social media bots and algorithms that would otherwise try to ban our conversation. Our first term is a review of a term that we debuted last season, cash drawing. Cash drawing is a noun that refers to the act whereby the monster under your bed reaches out, grabs you by the ankles, and suddenly pulls you under the bed, usually while you scream and vainly claw at the floor. Now, in this case, we're going to see a modified cash drawing since we have creatures living in the sewers, so you have to worry about sewer grates and manholes and gutters as opposed to under the bed, but it is the same principle. Our second term is a new term, and it is a phrase, load not properly secured. A load not properly secured is a phrase used to describe a condition where an actress's tracts of land are allowed to undulate freely beneath her shirt, unrestrained by the presence of elastic or underwire. This is a state that was fairly common in the 70s and 80s. Let's get into a summary of this film. In this film, Manhattan has a problem with an increasing number of missing persons. The leader of a local homeless shelter believes that the disappearances are related to a massive government cover-up related to the homeless people that live in the sewers and the subway tunnels and so on and so on. At the same time, a photographer chronicling that same local homeless population stumbles across the same covered-up, which involves hazardous waste stored in abandoned subway tunnels. And where you have hazardous waste stored in subway tunnels, you're going to end up with our villain profile, which is a C.H.U.D, a cannibalistic humanoid underground dweller. And there's the picture right there. These belong to the class of flesh-eating mutant humanoids. Their special powers, well, they really don't have any special powers other than claws and sharp teeth. There's a nice close-up of the sharp teeth right there. And their signature weapon includes claws and sharp teeth. Again, not really the type to carry around weapons other than their claws and sharp teeth. So let's talk about the things I liked about this film. It has a really cool title. The film really embraces the gritty urban nature of 1980s Manhattan. Did I mention the really cool title? And frankly, that's about it. I did not care for this film. This is one of those films that I watch maybe once a year, once every couple of years, because I forget that I dislike it and watch it and say, oh yeah, I remember, I don't like this film. I know it's a classic. I know it's one that you have to check off your horror film bucket list if you're a fan. I just don't care for this film. So let's get into things that I feel could have been better about this film. Right off the bat, there is too much talking. Policeman arguing with homeless shelter guy arguing with photographer arguing with his girlfriend. It is just non-stop, not just talking, but people arguing, and it is so tiresome. You have long stretches where nothing happens, and when I say long stretches, I'm referring to pretty much the entire film. Did I mention the long stretches where nothing happens other than people talking? That pretty well describes this film. With the exception of a few minutes at the end, it's a creature feature with no creatures. The creatures are implied, you never actually see them until the end of the film, and unlike Jaws, that doesn't really add to the tension of things. You have no likable characters, probably because they're always arguing with each other. And the creature effects in Humanoids from the Deep look positively brilliant when compared to C.H.U.D. Oh, and most of the kills happen off screen in C.H.U.D, so you don't even get to see that. So let's get into Steve's scorecard for this film. Kills, 7 plus another 6 implied, and that includes dogs. Bare breasts, drumroll please, none, of course. Cash drawings, you do get 1, although it involves a manhole as opposed to the monster under the bed. Loads not properly secured. The only interesting thing about this film, you have 6, or if you prefer, 3 pairs. 1980s tube tops, you have 1, which factors into that count of loads not properly secured. Christmas treeings, well, you kind of have 1. It's not that terrific at the end of the day because, you know, the special effects in this movie are kind of but it's there. Denogginings, you have 3, 2 of which occur off screen. And that is it. Bonus features, of course, this movie has a lot, so let's talk about some of the voluminous bonus features for this film. You have many, many boring conversations. I hope you see that as a plus because the film has plenty of them. It has ass makeup. Yes, the photographer's girlfriend, who is a model, is wearing ass makeup. You have crazy, stabby, homeless action, which is kind of cool. You get flamethrowers aimed at nothing. You get... She's supposed to be a model? Really? I'm sorry, but Kim Greist, no, I just don't see it, no. You get naked drain unclogging action, which is far less sexy than it sounds. You get a bloodbath, well, not exactly, but you get a blood shower. You get blood shower action, which comes right after the drain unclogging action. You get exploding truck action because in the 70s and 80s, everything exploded. You get a John Goodman sighting from early in his career. In addition, you get a J. Thomas sighting from early in his career. It's actually John Goodman and J. Thomas together doing a cameo as 2 police officers sitting down to dinner in a diner. You get Daniel Stern's terrifying hair. Why did Gwenivere talk about 70s hairstyles at the beginning of this show? Well, it is because of, for example, things like Daniel Stern's terrifying hair. If that is not an alien from outer space, I don't know what to think, but that is the stuff of nightmares. So let's get into Steve's final score for this film. We're going to give it 1.5 paws out of 4. I just don't like this film. I consider this a dull, tedious film where very little happens that has inexplicably become a cult classic. Again, probably because of the cool title. A horror film all fans need to see once, but mainly for the 80s nostalgia. Now, this film fits into the theme for tonight's show because it does, again, take kind of an urban legend and put it into a new environment. In this case, taking the urban legend of things living in the New York sewers, such as alligators, and turning it into cannibalistic mutant people. Now, I believe I am not a Manhattanite, so if anyone is more familiar with this than me, please sound off in the comments. I believe there are also urban legends about cannibals living in the sewers underneath Manhattan, but honestly, I don't know if those urban legends inspired this film or if this film inspired those urban legends. But either way, this takes the old urban legend about vicious creatures living in the subway and putting a modern twist on it involving mutants and hazardous waste. So it's got that going for it, but really I do not consider this that interesting a film. Like I said, you kind of need to check it off your film-going bucket list if you're a horror movie fan, so I won't say don't watch it. I would say don't set your expectations too high. Frankly, I found Humanoids from the Deep to be a far more entertaining film. You may disagree. If you disagree, please feel free to sound off in the comments, but that is Steve's final score for C.H.U.D. Well, we've come to the end of another episode of Spooky Tales with Steve the Cat, but before we go, once again, we're going to go around the horn and talk about some other things we all watched this week. I'm going to go first. This is Steve the Cat. This week, I watched a movie called The Lost Footage of Leah Sullivan. This is a found footage film from the year 2018. In this film, journalism student Leah Sullivan returns to her Massachusetts hometown to make a documentary about a 30-year-old cold case involving multiple murders. As she investigates the murders, she discovers that all is not as it appears, and the case may not be cold after all. Now, uninteresting title aside, I enjoyed this film. Now, it's a found footage film, so it's not a tour de force in terms of special effects. You're not going to have a gigantic cast. It's only a couple of people. But I enjoyed this film a lot. In the final third, where you have Leah inside the creepy haunted house with nothing but a camera and a flashlight, and things kind of popping up here and there, much like in Hell House LLC. There are some good jump scares. I jumped several times watching this film, so I do recommend it. Lost Footage of Leah Sullivan. Now let's throw things over to Professor Edgar Fluffosaurus.
Greetings to you all. I am Professor Edgar Fluffosaurus, and this week I had the misfortune of watching a film called Creature Cabin. As this film begins, a woman who is skilled in karate battles a number of men in robes, and then is killed by a black unicorn. She then inexplicably turns into a pool of blood. Later in the film, another woman, this one in a wheelchair, is pulled into the pool, causing the black unicorn to re-emerge. The re-emerged unicorn now has a human body and wings, but still has a unicorn's head. At this point I stopped the film and washed my eyes out with bleach. Ladies and gentlemen, I beg you to avoid this film at all costs. Do not pass go, do not collect $200, and do not watch Creature Cabin. And now I turn the microphone over to our friend Crimson Meerkat.
Hello. This is, well, you know who this is. This is Crimson Meerkat, conspiracy theorist extraordinaire and leader of the scientific endeavor known as Project Brevity. And this week, I watched a film called Time Lapse. In this film, a young couple and their roommate discover that their inventor next-door neighbor has died. So naturally, they go snooping through his house. As they snoop through his home, they discover their neighbor's invention, a camera that can take pictures from the future. Yes, it's a camera that takes pictures, but the pictures that come out are from 24 hours in the future. Well, you can see where this is going. They're going to use it to make themselves rich, but their attempts to use the camera to make themselves rich, although they seem to work at first, then start to go awry. Let me tell you something, folks. Never mess with time travel. 50 plus years of Doctor Who has given people a very cavalier attitude about time travel, but it is not something with which to be trifled. If you see a camera that can take pictures from the future in real life, turn around and run the other way. That said, it's a film that's worth watching if you understand that it is more of a sci-fi drama than a horror film. This will pop up in the horror queue on Tubi, for example, but it is more of a sci-fi drama than a horror film. I guess it's a hybrid between the two. But it is worth watching. It's not an action-packed thriller. It's more of a subtle drama, good just to kind of watch before bed one night. But that said, I recommend it, and that is my other film for this week.
Well, that brings us to the end of another episode of Spooky Tales with Steve the Cat. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the show. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please take a moment to give us a like and a share. The biggest thing you can do to help us out is to share this video. Also, feel free to leave a comment about the films we discussed tonight, or maybe tell us about your personal favorite horror movie that puts an updated spin on a familiar story. If you would like to stay up to date on our latest videos, then please take a moment to stop by and check us out on social media and hit that subscribe button. You can find Spooky Tales with Steve the Cat on Facebook, YouTube, and Rumble. And yes, that's Tales spelled with an A-I-L-S. Spooky Tales with Steve the Cat is just one of the shows you can find on the PBDCtv Broadcast Collective. If you're interested in horror, true crime, weird history, creepy stories, or unexplained events, then PBDCtv is sure to have something for you. You can find us online at PBDCtv.com, and you can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, and Rumble. We'll be back with 2 more horror movies next week, so we hope to see you again then. Once again, thank you for joining us. Everyone stay safe and have a great week. We'll see you again soon. Good night, everybody.